Last informational clip within this second module. Now in this clip, we're going to start looking at IAM best practices. Now I imagine you're already pretty familiar with IAM, but we just want to do a quick review on some of the best practices to really ensure that our account is going to be compliant and as secure as possible. Now the first main thing is, obviously IAM is the core service for all access control and authentication for our AWS accounts. Everything starts with IAM essentially whenever we're interacting. Now, the next is a list of some key best practices, and the first one is to always enable MFA, especially on the root account, and then lock away your credentials for root if you can. A lot of teams will take this, they'll enable MFA and then take their credentials for root and lock it in a safe somewhere where only certain individuals can access it. The next is to always take your least privilege approach. So only give out what is actually needed. Don't give too many permissions. You always want to utilize roles for delegating permissions, so avoid using static users whenever possible. And then if you do have static credentials, be sure to regularly rotate those. Now it's actually recommended to rotate every 90 days or so. And then the last point I want to touch on is that you should always use managed policies instead of inline whenever possible. And this is really for tracking purposes more than anything. You can control these managed policies a lot easier than inline policies. And the last note here is obviously understanding IAM is extremely important. So I do recommend you deep dive into IAM whenever you get the time. So let's go ahead and look at IAM in the console itself. Now you can see I'm at the IAM screen, and this is the default dashboard that we get, and I'm really just going to show you a few quick things. The first thing is the security status here on the middle of the page. You can see that we have activated MFA on our root account, we created an individual user to log in as, we used groups, and then we applied a password policy. So these are the first 4 steps that AWS really recommends when we first get into IAM. Now to set some of these, we really want to go to account settings here, and this loads our password policy. So this is where we're going to specify our different minimum requirements for passwords for our static users. And it gets pretty detailed. We can set different requirements for a password itself, when they can change it or if they're allowed to, and how many of the last ones are remembered that they cannot use. And then another little nifty feature here is at the bottom, we can actually disable security token service per region. So I deactivated everything outside of the US because I'll never use it. So now I can always be sure that I'll only ever have STS active in these US regions. Now the very last thing I want to show you with this before we wrap this up is this credential report. So what this does is it allows us to download a report of all of the account's users and the status of their credentials. So I already downloaded one of these, and let's take a look at what it looks like. Now we can see here we have our root account here, and as you can see, we can see our first user is our root account, and then we have me, and it shows a few different properties. We can see our user creation time, our password enabled, which is either true or false, when it was last used, last changed. We can see if MFA is active, if our access keys are active, and it actually shows on both pairs of access keys, which is really nice. And then if I scroll all the way to the end, we can see if we had certs active for authentication, they would show up here as well. So this is a very handy report that you can use to quickly view the status of different credentials within your AWS account. Now that's going to do it for this clip on IAM best practices. We're going to wrap it up, and I'll see you in the next one where we're going to have a summary and an overview of what we all discussed. All right, way to go. You did it. You made it all the way to the end of this second module in this course, and we're just going to end this on a really quick summary. Now, the first thing we really talked about was CloudWatch, and what we use CloudWatch for is monitoring and logging needs. So remember, we're always going to push all of our logs to CloudWatch, and then from there we can actually stream those to different locations like Kinesis, a Lambda function, or even something off-site that we can monitor on using metric filters. And we also use CloudWatch for alarming and notifying us via an SNS topic when certain metric thresholds were crossed. The next thing we talked on was implementing CloudTrail for your monitoring and auditing actions. So we created and enabled our CloudTrail trail to really track all of the events that were going on within our account. And if you remember, we pushed them to a specific bucket where we encrypted them, and then we also made sure that they were validated as they were being saved. And then we took a look at Guard Duty and Inspector and how those tools can really offload vulnerability management. They really allow an automated process to be taken for all of the tedious vulnerability scanning and malicious activity monitoring. And then we just finished up with an IAM best practices review, touching on some of the key aspects that AWS recommends themselves. Now that's going to do it for the second module. We're going to wrap it up, and I'll see you in the next one, where we're going to start looking at the different tools that are available to us for managing our storage in AWS.